welcome to the Ask Me Anything webinar. This is our chance to take our motto to that you see on our website quite often to a live question and answer format here. Today we're going to be talking about Rustici Engine's API. So some introductions here first. My name is Ryan Pfeiffer. I'll be your MC here today. I'm also a senior account manager here at Rustici Software. Been here for about 6.5 years or so. So as I mentioned, I see some familiar names that have logged in here today. So I've had several conversations with folks on the call, and got some special guests that are far more knowledgeable than myself here as well. I've got Kyle Patmor and Ben Clark with me that are here to talk a lot more detail about Engine's API than I probably ever could. So we'll cover some of the new features in Engine 22 as well, and answer a lot of questions that have been submitted. Kyle, Ben, I'll let you guys introduce yourself. Ben, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Ben Clark. I'm the lead on the Engine team. I've been here for 13 years, been in the e-learning space for 17 now. Yeah, and so I've been working on Engine for most of that 13 years that I've been here. Kyle?
Yeah, and I'm Kyle Patmor. I'm Director of Client Integrations and Support at Rustici. So what that means is probably if you are an existing customer working with Engine, I've probably communicated with you at some point, maybe during your integration. I've been here about 8 years, and for most of that time working primarily with the Engine product and a couple of the other integrated products, working with customers as they sort through all of the things that come with integrating with Engine, and also heavily involved with the Engine team itself, just to bring some of that customer perspective into what we're doing on that team as well. So lots of experience with customers and the issues that they're having.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Ben. So first, before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to everyone that submitted questions ahead of time. We got a lot of great questions, and we'll do our best to get all of them answered here live. These webinars are really all about you, all about our customers and the questions that you have. So we've made some effort here after reviewing to sort of break the webinar down into a few different topics. So it flows pretty well. We'll start with a bit of an overview and more basic questions. We want to start there because we do have some varying levels of knowledge on the call with us today. So the overwhelming majority of folks, when they answered that question, fall into this category of they're aware but don't know a whole lot about Engine. The next most common response was that they're actually pretty knowledgeable about Engine. So somewhere in the middle, but then we've got folks on the opposite ends of the spectrum as well, some that have never even heard of it, and some that are even very knowledgeable. So we really appreciate everybody's, the wide range of folks that we got on the call here today. So yeah, we'll start with a little bit more basic questions, and then we'll dive into some more technical topics. So I want to jump in and answer the most common question we get with these webinars here first. Yes, we are recording, and yes, we will be sending out a link to view this once the recording is ready, and that'll include several of the resources and helpful links that we might throw into the chat or relate to the topics and questions that we answer. So special shout out here before we get started as well to our marketing team of Tara and Kelly and Alicia, who do a wonderful job putting these webinars on and making sure that we stay on track and organized. Another one of our team members working behind the scenes here today, Joshua Turner from our client integrations team. If you've ever done an upgrade here on Engine, you've probably interacted with Joshua. He's going to be helping with posting some links and answering maybe some questions that come in the Q&A box. So with that, let's get started talking about Engine and getting started on its API. So as I mentioned, we've got a great group of folks here who are current Engine customers. We've got some folks that are sort of Engine curious, if you will, and some folks that maybe are just in the e-learning industry and want to know more about what we do. So overall, we'll cover several different things. I'll kind of do a little bit of a rundown here. We'll start with covering questions about things Engine can do. This will probably cover a lot of the most common things people are knowledgeable about with Engine, what Engine does. But we get a lot of questions about other things that Engine can do beyond that. So we'll cover some of that as well. We'll discuss how you get data out of Engine and work with it. We'll answer a few questions about moving from SCORM Cloud to Rustici Engine, since that's a somewhat common thing that folks explore if you're a current cloud customer. We'll talk about all of the new features of our latest release, which is Engine 22. You may have seen some communication about that here within the last few months. And then finally, we'll chat about one of our favorite topics, which is what a lot of customers come to us with initial questions about building your own support for these e-learning standards versus buying Engine. So the whole build versus buy conversation. So again, let's jump right into it. So opener question, what is the Engine API and why would I want to use it in my application? Before I hand it over to Kyle and Ben here, I want to sort of give a brief, high level overview, since there are some folks on here that may not have a whole lot of familiarity with Engine. So Rustici Engine is our core piece of software. It's our standard e-learning standards based content player. Most folks know us as being able to import, launch, and track SCORM content, AICC, XAPI, CMI5. We go beyond the e-learning standards at this point now, but it is a content player that you integrate with your application to sort of abstract the complexity of dealing with and complying with these weird e-learning standards. So from a business perspective, that's usually the overview that I give. But again, we've brought some folks along here that are can speak at a far more technical level. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kyle to add a little bit more flavor there.
Yeah, that's a great overview, Ryan. And I think the main thing that customers are coming for to us is just to not have to think about how do I launch a SCORM course or one of the 4 or 5 other learning standards that we support. As Ryan mentioned, it started out being called SCORM Engine, and we had to change the name because Engine has evolved into a thing that is a place where you can bring in content of various types, launch it. We will help track the progress in that, and then give you a way to report on that data in a more general way without having to understand, what each one of those standards is doing. So usually we're integrated into LMS, which is a logical place, but sometimes HR systems or large organizations who have systems that they've built themselves where they want to bring in content that's been authored in some authoring tool that supports one of these learning standards. So the Engine API we've talked about here, we reference it. If you're not already using Engine, or maybe you're on an older version of Engine where you weren't using the API, is our way of your application integrating with Engine. So if you want to bring a course in that you want to launch, you're using an API call for that. If you want to go and launch a course for a learner, you're using API calls. So this is a way for us to keep your application and ours sort of separate, but give you all of the touch points for doing the things you need to do with Engine to get learners in there and launching and getting that progress out. So as we go through the other questions, we'll hit on some of the highlights of the other things that Engine can do and are planning to do. And if you have any questions about any of those or specific things, let us know in the chat.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kyle. So yeah, you mentioned talking about things Engine can do. So let's jump into some of those questions. First question we got was, how can I get course progress status?
Yeah, I mean, one of the only reasons you have it is to get progress out of it, right? Like you're not just arbitrarily launching courses for people and then who cares what happens after that point. You want to get the fact that they completed the course. Maybe you're tracking, did quizzes where they passed and fail, what kind of score they got and how long they were in the course, which a lot of like compliance type training is also focused not just on completing it, but how long did you spend in that. And so getting that course progress out of Engine back into your own database tables or reporting platform is one of the most important pieces once you've got this going. Of course, like any API-based application, there are API calls that you can make to get the status, that progress data for a particular learner. You'll hear us use the term registration, which is something that represents, I've got a learner who's taking a particular course. We're storing the data about, when they're launching and the progress with that. And we do that with a registration. So, you could use the API, you could make API calls to get these registrations and update your tables from that. But usually customers are using one of our mechanisms, a webhook, so the engine, when we update the registration, we will then push those updates out to your system using this webhook system. Now, Engine has had what we would call a postback mechanism for registration status updates for ever since we implemented the API. And in Engine 22, which we'll probably talk in a little more detail later, we've implemented a new webhook system for your system to subscribe to topics like this and be able to get updated with the details on the registrations as they get updated. So that's the primary mechanism. We're going to push that data as it updates an engine, and then your endpoint would then pull out the pieces that you care about, save those into your tables, update your UI, and reporting after that.
Excellent. Yeah, really appreciate that, Kyle. So interesting question that came in here. So what is the architectural diagram of Rustici's overall infrastructure and processes? So we'll set this up a little bit with some folks may not know that there's multiple different deployment types of our software. Lots of our customers deploy on-premise, but we also offer managed hosting services where Rustici can deploy and manage an environment with Engine deployed on your behalf. So with that said, can you guys talk a little bit about the architectural diagram, overall infrastructure there for each different scenario?
Sure. And I'll note that we have those diagrams that you can see, which I can't show you on here, but that'll get posted into the chat, so you can go look at that at your leisure afterwards, or try to follow along if you want. So in our managed hosting environment, and it's very similar in our cloud environment, we have a load balancer. We have several different instances of Engine running behind that load balancer. Just for availability, we would recommend that we do recommend that people do that sort of deployment, even if they have enough, even if they have a large enough machine that they can serve all their traffic with one machine. It's good to have multiple box instances there, multiple boxes running, so that if one has a problem, then the others can take over. So behind that load balancer, also we are using S3 to store the content. So the load balancer and specifically Amazon's, I'm forgetting the name for it now, but there's a specific name for it, but it's Amazon's load balancer that also handles caching. It can also handle cookie authentication. So Engine will send the appropriate cookies so that the load balancer can authenticate the request to the content, and the content just lives on S3. The instances don't have to get involved with any of the work of serving up that content. So that keeps the content secure, but it keeps Engine from having to deal with that content. And then, of course, all those instances are communicating with the same backend database. Within managed hosting, we actually have one database that is the main database that is constantly updating another one in another availability zone, so that if the database goes down, it can fall over. And that is something you can probably do something like that in your own on-premise environments as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we talk about new features that we've added recently in Engine, when it comes to bigger deployments, we have now support for memcache as a additional sort of external caching mechanism, so that, in the past, most caching was done in memory on the servers, but if you have a load balancer and you have 20 instances of Engine running, then it's better for you to have a centralized cache that all of those can share, rather than using the resources on the box and having those go away. So memcache is a new thing that we're supporting in Engine that you could spin up in some of these high availability type situations if you wanted to. I think the other thing here from an architecture standpoint, just to add is, Engine is available for self-hosting, if you're not using our infrastructure, and we offer both a Java version, a Java web app, and a .NET
Yes.
framework web application. And so, many people who are on the .NET version of Engine, when they look to cloud providers, they may look for Microsoft Azure or some other sort of hosting platform, which you can essentially do the same things that we're doing over in the AWS infrastructure in those platforms as well, and it is well supported in that way. So there's a wide variety of ways that you can deploy Engine. From a database standpoint, we support 4 different databases as the backend. So we support MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and PostgreSQL. So all of those, when you're self-hosting, you can pick, which one of those is appropriate for your team. Our advice with those kinds of things is, pick the architecture and the platforms that your team is comfortable with if you're self-hosting, so that, because it's on you to make sure that that is going to run in a performant way, it's not going to fail, and so forth. So you want to pick something that meets what your experience is in most cases.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Kyle. So along the same lines, when you're talking about whether it's deploying on premise or if we're hosting, what's the best way to continually test our integration in lower environments?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think when you said there with integration is key, because Engine itself, we test through our API frequently, or most of our tests are hitting our API, and that's automated. To whatever extent you can automate your tests, that's very helpful. And this is just a general testing point, I guess, not specific to Engine. Another thing that I think it's really not specific to Engine, but because you're testing integration, it's most important for you to test through your application. Whatever your application is doing, if you're testing your application properly with the latest update of Engine, then you'll see that Engine is doing what it has to do. But to really make sure you're think about what Engine's doing for you and hit those points. So Engine is handling the learning standards. So if you want to test the integration with Engine specifically, see how your application is handling different learning standards, throw different versions of various things at it and see how that goes.
Yeah. And, the thing that some people ask us when they're starting with Engine, self-hosted customers, can we install Engine in multiple places? Is it just on our production server? Are we allowed to do it in other places? And of course, the answer is yes, you can. Like, from a licensing perspective, we expect that you're going to install Engine in a QA environment, in a staging, maybe on developer machines if you're developing locally with your own application. So take advantage of that so that you're able to, do the type of testing that gives you the confidence that everything together is working. From our managed hosted customers, we by default will provide you both with a production environment and a development testing type environment. And we use that to, maybe if we're going to do an upgrade on your production environment, we would do it in your development first, so that you can make sure that your integration with the application will work as expected before we roll that out into production where actual users are impacted. So that idea definitely is good for any sort of integration with Engine.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks both of you guys. Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about the basics of what Engine supports. We've talked about deployment and infrastructure. So let's switch gears here a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more beyond that of what Engine can do. So first question we got that would fall under this category is, how much flexibility is there in the UI of the player?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it comes up frequently with customers. And the first answer is, for the most part, there is no UI that is visible to a learner in a lot of cases. The Engine's player is relatively simple, and really the focus is on launching that content that you have and tracking the progress. And for single activity courses, which the vast majority of packages coming from authoring tools are, there's no need for us to provide a UI. So the course itself has its own internal sort of navigation. It has an exit button at the end that they click, which makes us trigger the exit of the player, or hopefully it does if they're following best practices. And so there's not a necessity for a UI. However, there are situations where a UI does exist. So if you have multi-SCO, if you're a SCORM person, or multiple activity courses where we as the player need to provide an interface for learners to be able to navigate between those different activities, then we do have a UI that will show up. And you can customize that. There are kind of two mechanisms for that. We allow you to specify a custom style sheet. So you can pretty much come in and override any of the styles that we have in the player. And then we have this concept of a customization script, which when we load up the player, we'll go and execute this JavaScript in the context of the player. And some customers will use that to go further with, either, it doesn't happen very often, but modifying even the DOM of the player if you needed to. Sometimes it's doing things like modifying a message that we might be providing, or putting in an activity timer or something of that nature. There are different use cases for the customization script, and it kind of gives you an escape hatch for doing things that go beyond what you could just do with CSS. So those are all things that my team would work with you on if you have a particular use case on what you need to do. There is also a setting for adding in a logo in the player UI. It shows up on the bar. If it's visible, it would be there aside from that as well. So that's mostly what people do with the UI. The media content that we'll talk about later, where it's not just a packaged learning standard, there is a UI that we have involved with that. So if it's PDF or video, and for those, we also have settings for style sheets that you can use to customize that interface as well.
It's interesting, this question leading to all this customization coming right after the one about testing. I just want to point out to folks that there's a bit of a trade-off there, that when you start customizing a lot, we try to keep in mind that people have done customizations, but it's still prudent. The more customizations you have done, the more they dig into the guts of the player, the more testing you probably ought to do when you deploy a new version of Engine.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Great, thanks guys. Yeah, it's a very common question we get here, so appreciate those answers. I love this next question. So how well is Engine set up to support user-generated content as well as platform admin built content? So I'm going to make an attempt to answer this first. From my perspective, the non-technical answer to this is quite well. And then I'll hand it over to Kyle and Ben, because I know you can add much more color to that. But yeah, this is the way I interpret that in question is when you say when user generated content is maybe some off the shelf content that's that they've purchased through some content vendor and they need to bring into your system, and then platform admin built content is maybe a lot of our customers they offer a learning platform, but they also have a content library that comes along with it. So can that be imported and tracked and launched and tracked in Engine? So again, we're quite well set up to handle that. But Ben, Kyle, I'll let you add much more color to that than I could.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly right. And I think one of the points to make there is that as long as it's a learning standard package, wherever you got it from, it follows the specification for the things that Engine supports, then you shouldn't have an issue with launching and tracking it. Or if it's like one of the media content types, PDF, MP4 videos, MP3s, YouTube or something, then, no problem with that. Now, what I find, from the support standpoint, where we're getting frontline questions from people about content, and you've branched out and let your customers start bringing these packages that either they bought from somebody or they authored themselves, there are going to be times where it technically works, but it doesn't exactly do what you're expecting packages to do. So maybe you always want it to have a completion status and a pass fail status, but this particular vendor only sends a completion status. It doesn't care about pass fail. It doesn't send a score. And so, there may be places where your expectations about what kind of data is coming to your system has to adjust for some of this variability of what content can set and what it has to set, which is a big difference. But the other thing is, the good thing with Engine is over the last 15 or 20 years or whatever the Engine has been evolving, the plus and minus of that is that we have this really large set of settings that you can use at a course level to adjust some of the behaviors of those particular packages to try to bring them in line with what your expectations are. And one of the benefits of working with us specifically is we have people like Joe Donnelly and Ryan and the other support members who have seen all the possible things you could see with course content at this point in their career with Rustici. And so we're well equipped to help you work through some of the issues that you might find as you're testing the content. But the important thing is, if people are bringing content, you should probably give them a way to test it before they roll it out to their users, because you don't want to bring in a package and then just have 100,000 learners start launching it and realize, oh, this package doesn't, behave like I thought it was going to. So another place where testing and giving people a way to preview or test that content ahead of time is probably a good idea. So hopefully that
Fantastic.
answers that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle. So you mentioned media files. You mentioned some things beyond e-learning standards. So let's talk more about that. A lot of folks just know us as a SCORM player, and we get a lot of questions on the account management team or when we're talking about new features. Our reaction often is, "Oh, wow, it does that too." So let's talk about some of the things that Engine can do beyond some of the most basic things like supporting SCORM. So media files, content connectors, some of the other things you've mentioned. Can you talk about those?
Sure. I'll talk about a few, and I'll let Ben talk about a couple of these too. But one of the things that we've mentioned or hinted at in the media content, if you're like a long-time Rustici customer and still on an older version, or have upgraded but haven't really changed what you're doing, you may have just started out as, I've got SCORM courses and I want to launch and track them, which Engine still does. But in recent versions, we've added this ability to say, okay, I have a PDF that I want my learners to launch, and I want to track the progress that they have on that and whether they've completed it. I have a MP4 video that I've taken that I want them to watch, and I want to track that. I have these YouTube videos, or I have something hosted on Vimeo where I want to track those things as well. The other one that frankly doesn't get that much usage yet is also MP3 audios. So I have this training audio or something of that nature. I want people to be able to listen to that and then track that. We can do all of those things in Engine now, so it doesn't have to just be a learning standard package. And the good thing about it is, from an API perspective, you're importing that thing using one of our API endpoints. In a lot of cases, it's the same API endpoint you're using for importing these zip packages. And then the way that you create registrations and the way that you launch that and the way that you get the progress back from Engine, all of that part's the same. So one of the big selling points with Engine is, from your application's perspective, it doesn't matter what that thing is. Once you've imported it into Engine, how you interact with it is the same regardless. So MediaCon is a big one that people are starting to add that support into the application. The other thing that people may not be aware of is the offline support or offline extension that Engine has. It is an additional license to Engine, and it does have some limitations, but some customers have used this in order to allow the downloading and offline playing and tracking of SCORM packages in their own mobile application. So if you are building a mobile application and you want the learners to be able to download that course package and launch and then track the progress and sync it back up to Engine so that then it gets reported to your LMS, that is something that we have. It is an additional license. There's some development effort involved on that side on your team, and it is specific to SCORM. Just based on the nature of how these other learning standards work, offline is a much different proposition for something, say, XAPI based or AIC. So something to be aware of. One of the other things we haven't talked about, content connectors. I'll let Ben talk about that a little bit, where that comes into play with Engine.
Thanks, Kyle. So yeah, content connectors are just a way we implement it with a plugin, so you can actually add a content connector without upgrading to the next version of Engine if one comes out within an Engine release, and it just allows you to pull in content from one of our partners, or there's one which is a YouTube connector. You can pull in YouTube content. We don't actually partner with them, but you can pull in that content anyway because they have a public API. So we're continually looking for new sorts of content that we can pull in that way, in addition to the other ways that we add new content. I think that's all I'll say on that one for now.
Yeah. And Go, just to mention specifically, right now we have a connector with Go1, which is a content library vendor. And so these allow you to have easier access to those content libraries and bring them in and import them. So something to look into if that's what you need in your platform is to do that kind of thing.
Fantastic. So let's talk about XAPI and CMI5 a little bit. First, fairly simple question. Does Rustici Engine support XAPI and CMI5?
Yes, absolutely. It does. We were involved in the development of the XAPI spec as it was coming out. I was specifically. We used to call it something else even, but I won't go there. So, we support those. We're going to continue to support versions of that as they change. There is an XAPI 2.0 coming out that we're going to be supporting as well. It really is a pretty minor update, but it is changing some requirements that are technically breaking changes. So it is being called 2.0. And it will be under the IEEE, which some people, actually care a lot about that. And if you're one of those people, then that's great news. Yeah, I guess I'm seeing that we're a little short on time for the number of questions we have. So with CMI5, I'll leave it as, again, we were very involved in the development of CMI5. And we did this project Catapult that you should look at regarding to that. But we absolutely do support it. We're going to continue to support it. We're going to stay up to date with it.
Fantastic. Yeah. Again, and being mindful of time here, I want to sort of jump down to a related question. Are there any technical considerations for taking advantage of XAPI?
Yes, there absolutely are. XAPI, it potentially gives you just a flood of data. So you need to think about how much data you actually want to track. You need to think about sometimes the form of that data. If you're creating on the content side or on the LMS side, you need to just deal with somehow figuring out how you're going to understand that data. We did a whole webinar on that, which is going to be put in the chat. So if you're really interested in that question, you should really go look at that.
Fantastic. Couple questions we got that are related to third-party systems. So one is, how do you get data out of Rustici Engine and into third-party systems? Is that something you can use XAPI for?
Yes, absolutely. You can use XAPI. And when XAPI was being conceived and developed, one of the big problems people were trying to solve with SCORM, which is what we were looking at before it, to say as this is something to, I guess, not just improve upon, but we want to solve the issues people are seeing with this, a big one was I want to get at my data. So XAPI is very focused on being able to get your data. So it's baked into the standard that you can get it out, and also within Engine itself, we do this thing called statement pipes, where we have a feature that is mainly just using what's there in the standard to pull statements out of one system, such as Engine, and push it into another that can consume those statements. You do, of course, have to then do some work to understand what exactly is in those statements, but it really has all the data you need, and it's in a format that is documented.
Fantastic. Another person asked, I want to offer our content to customers with their own LMS and take advantage of XAPI data benefits. Will publishing our content in CMI5 work?
I think that the context of this is maybe with our cloud and dispatch sort of product, where the content you have is authored for CMI5, it's collecting XAPI data, but then you're wanting to share that out to a customer using our dispatch, which is really just a way for you to keep control of your actual content and provide a kind of a proxy or stub package out of various learning standards. And the answer to that is yes. You can. Dispatch works with, your course can be anything that Engine supports, or in this case, probably SCORM Cloud supports, and then you can dispatch that out as whatever learning standards are supported on the dispatch side. So your course may be CMI5, the dispatch package might be SCORM 1.2, and Engine will deal with those differences, and we'll be collecting the XAPI data from that CMI5 course into Engine. It would be available to you, and your customer would be getting those SCORM updates with completion status and so forth on that side.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Ben. So yeah, and I'll mention here real quick too, Ben sort of called it out. We've talked a little bit about CMI5 as a companion spec for XAPI. So again, interest of time, I want to just mention here real quick that if that's of interest to you, you want some more information, check out our Catapult project resources that we'll link out to in our follow-up. I believe maybe we've posted some in the chat here as well, but there's a lot of great information there as well as you dig into the CMI5 standard. So let's move on to our most recent release of Engine. So Engine 22 was released here in December. So as our most recent major release, there's some pretty cool features in there. A lot of folks have heard the news about this release, but are wondering what are these new features and what's compelling to upgrade to Engine 22.
Yeah, one of the things we've already sort of mentioned, the big one is the webhooks, the new improved webhook system. As I said, there was a way to do some very limited postbacks from Engine for registration status or maybe an import completion. But with the new webhook system, there's much more flexibility there to hook in and have your system notified when various things happen. So one of the big things, if you're already using postbacks, it's different there. Before, it was very much whenever the registration changed, we sent you a post with the data for the registration. You could update your system. But sometimes, those updates, nothing significant actually changed. It may be some runtime detail that you're not collecting or care about on your system. And so the frequency of those would be much more often than was necessary maybe to get you the information that you wanted. And so the webhook system filters that out to a bit and allows you to filter it even more, so that only when things that you're concerned about change, that's when you're going to get notified. So maybe you only care to know when the completion status changes, and so you could subscribe to that, and that's when we would update you and say, okay, here's the state of the registration, that's been done. So that flexibility is, and the filtering involved with that is one of the big selling points of the new webhooks. There are probably some other things that I'm forgetting, and Ben can can remind me there, that go along with webhooks. Is there anything else that we should call out with that, do you think, related to what's improved there?
Well, besides the scheduling, or no, the filtering, as you put, not really scheduling, we when a notification fails, this is like the old webhooks too. We have a configurable retry queue, but all the failed messages are logged in the same way. And actually, this is the important point I want to make there, is that what we had postbacks, but each was its own thing, and you would configure it differently. Webhooks are all configured in the same way. We're going to be adding more of them. They're going to look very much the same. There's going to be the message you're getting will have certain boilerplate information from any webhook you get from us, and then the contents of the specific thing you care about. So it will all just be more streamlined and standardized, not standardized, but similar. And then some other features for when things go wrong, like a notification of failed notifications, which that might seem like a weird thing. How does that actually help you? Because if the notifications are failing, how will your notification of a failed notification work? Well, the solution to that is you send your failed notifications to something different than where you're getting your normal notifications, and you could have it doing much less processing, just logging what you're getting. There's also an API for checking the last failure. Great.
And I think we've also added improved mechanisms for authenticating our requests to your side. I think, now more of an OAuth type client credential situation where, you can set that up with your webhooks for us to communicate securely to your endpoint. Some of that stuff was possible with a plugin in previous versions of Engine, but this just consolidates all of that into one mechanism for all of those, as Ben was mentioning. I know we're getting close towards the end. A couple of other things that Engine 22 had, there's improvements to like how we handle background processes, which most of the time people may not even be aware that they're running in the background. But if you're in an environment where you've got a bunch of different servers behind a load balancer, you may not want all of them running these background processes for like sending statement pipes or the queued requests and things like that. And so the background process management features in 22 let you determine which of those each machine is going to run if that's something that's necessary. The other big thing is this custom metadata for courses. Again, a somewhat limited use case, but in a situation where you want to store in Engine with that course certain pieces of information, like maybe a category or keyword or something, where later you're going to get that data back out. You're going to say, give me the course details. Let me see these other custom attributes that I want to look at. You have that ability now when you're importing to basically give us an object with a set of properties that you define and then receive later. So those are some of the highlights on 22. A lot of the things we've been talking about, media content and other things, have come in the last several versions of Engine. So if you're further beyond that, there's been a lot of change in the last 3 or 4 versions of Engine to add a lot of these features.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Ben. So yeah, we're getting really close to 10:45 or 10:45 Central Time here in the US. We plan on staying around until the top of the hour to continue answering questions. But just a reminder, if anybody does need to drop off, we're recording the entire webinar and we'll send that out. So don't feel like you'll miss out on something. You can tune in later to the recording. So we got a live question. Great question from Troy that we'll go ahead and answer here. Is there a reliable and consistent technique to 1, capture test questions and the text thereof, 2, capture the possible test question answers and the text thereof, and 3, capture the student's answers?
I think either one of us could probably answer this. Ben, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I'm saying the reliable and consistent, I think, is a hang up there. You can definitely do a lot of that with interactions, but you definitely need the content's cooperation on that. I mean, yeah, if you're authoring content, SCORM interactions definitely comes to mind, as well as you can do that interaction tracking in XAPI or CMI5. You could put the question text in the description of the interaction, but and it could get into reports, but systems might not realize it is the question text. There isn't really a way to say this is the question text. You can just put in a description. Certainly the answers can be captured in interactions, and the possible answers, there's a way to capture that there. Kyle, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, a few things, because this comes up frequently, and actually there is an article that that I put up, I don't know, a couple months ago, related to working with interactions coming from Engine. But one of the main points there is that the learning standard involved determines the level of detail that you can get for these things. So all of them that we support will give you something about, what's the ID of the question, what's the answer that the learner gave, was it right or wrong, what were the possible, or what were the correct answers. What we don't have is what are all the possible test questions. If that learner didn't take and answer the question, then you may not have a record. There is no mechanism for a course saying there's 50 questions, these are what they are, these are all the possible answers. That is just not a thing that is defined in these standards. And so what we're doing is capturing what's coming from what the learner did. And so you're limited to that data set and what is possible there. So a lot of people will ask, okay, they answered A, and I know that's the right answer, but what were the other possible answers? Well, we can't tell you that. It's not a thing that is, defined as a data point that they can report to us. And if you're looking for supporting interactions and test questions, you want to have a more modern learning standard. SCORM 2004 allows you to put, as Ben said, in the description, the question text. And then the XAPI based ones, they have that ability as well to have that full question and answer text as part of that. But if you're using SCORM 1.2, you're very limited in what you can see from that. It may be just identifiers for things rather than the actual text of those items. But you can check out that article. There's some information about those things that we're talking about.
And I'll throw back, in that with XAPI and CMI5, you could potentially put in statements that describe what the possible questions are, what the possible actions are, but there's no common way to understand what that is. So you would need to control both ends of that so that you can record them and then have someone understand them, that there's no language, there's no shared language around it.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, so and Troy clarified a little bit here. He's asking about client authored SCORM courses over which they have very little control. So is it safe to assume that you'll have to do some coaching of your clients on what they need to do there, Troy? So
yeah, and one of the things is, some of these authoring tools, you may have quiz in the course, but it's not actually reporting the details of those answers through the SCORM API that it's calling. Like, it's just internally storing that information. And so that's another factor. You're like, hey, it has a quiz, why am I not getting anything? Well, your course is not actually telling us about that.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, so keep the questions coming if you've got them. We'll switch gears here a little bit. I'm interested in migrating from SCORM Cloud API to Engine potentially, and would like to learn more about webhooks available in the recent release. I think maybe Kyle, you've got some, general discussion about migrating from Cloud to Engine, since it's a question we've gotten several times.
Yeah, sure. And the webhooks part, we've already sort of talked about that, but with Cloud to Engine, some people may start off, it's very easy to get started with the API on Cloud. And then as you grow and you decide, okay, I need my own environment, you may decide to come over to Engine. The good thing is that your work with the SCORM Cloud API is very similar to what you would be doing with the Rustici Engine API. So importing courses, creating registrations, launch links, the idea of getting data back from them with postbacks or webhooks, all of that is very similar. But there are some differences in how things are implemented, because SCORM Cloud is an application that's built on top of Engine. And so it has some concerns that we don't have as sort of that integrated piece. And so they've built on top of that. So there are things that you can do in cloud and in its API calls, like say tags, that we don't do in Engine. So what I would say, what I tell people, if you know right now that you are just temporarily on cloud and are going to go to Engine, and you're looking at using like a client library for the API, you would be better off using an Engine API client library against cloud, because then your code doesn't have to change when you are moving to Engine, because it's going to limit you to only things that Engine can do. You can do that, and it will work against cloud because there's enough similarity there that it functions. If you go the other way and start off with the cloud client library, you will have some minor changes to your application around authentication, and you may be using certain API calls or things that we just don't support in Engine. Generally, that's a pretty straightforward process of changing that, but it is something to consider if you know that your goal is, in a year I'm going to be on Engine. Maybe you start off with this in mind as a first part. The other thing we do have the possibility of migrating in data out of a cloud into our managed hosted Engine infrastructure. We've had a few customers to go down this road where we bring over their courses and the data into that environment. So it's definitely easier if you don't do that in a lot of ways, but if you have a lot of data there and you need that to be over in this other environment, we can do that between the cloud and the managed infrastructure, because we sort of control both sides of that process.
Fantastic. Thanks again, guys. So another live question. This one relates to CMI5. So the question is mainly on third-party LMS Moodle. I know that the self-development CMI5 content will get support with Engine. Is there any support with Moodle LMS?
I don't know. Ben, you can answer that.
Yeah, so there isn't support for CMI5 in Moodle, last I heard, because what I hear is that people are using Engine, they're using Content Controller, and to actually play the CMI5 content, and then they're dispatching it into Moodle, and that is a way people are working around that. So a lot of people are using Moodle and they're using CMI5, but Moodle's not handling the CMI5 aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, and that really goes back to the question that I answered earlier, where we were talking about, can I use CMI5 and send it to my customers? It's that if you're using Rustici Engine, there's an add-on called Dispatch, which lets you do that. Content Controller is our full-fledged application for doing the same type of thing and controlling licensing and other bits. But both of them have that capability if you're going to do that.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, guys. Yeah, if anybody has questions about some of those content distribution solutions to help address some of those, scenarios like what was brought up here with Moodle, or just generally distributing to other third parties, we'd be happy to talk to you guys about that. Although we don't have time to do all that in the next 7 minutes. So last question. Obviously, if anybody has any more questions, type them into the chat and we'll get to them. But my favorite one, let's talk about the buy versus build scenario here. So we get this a lot, especially from incoming prospects that are checking out Engine for the first time. So what the specific question we got is, can you explain what a typical learning/implementation time would be to support all equivalent standards if taking a build your own approach?
A long time. I mean, honestly, like we were discussing this question before the webinar, and at some level, we've thrown around the idea of, okay, each learning standard may be a year for a developer to go and implement that. When you factor in all of the different learning standards Engine supports, that can add up to quite a lot of different things. And I think one of the more important points, maybe than how long is it going to take, is even if you could do it, should you do it? We have a lot of people or customers who already actually had done it themselves, and they had a SCORM implementation. They may have had some of the other learning standards, and they come and say, we don't want to fool around with this anymore. Like, we don't want to support it. We don't want to have to improve it as time goes on. And so they've done away with their implementation and gone with Engine, because you're outsourcing a set of knowledge and support burden that you currently would then have to deal with. Our team answers questions all the time about this course doesn't work, or my completion's not coming through, or this learning standard is doing this thing. And we can answer those because that's what we do all day long. But when you take on that support to do it yourself, then now those questions are coming to you and you've got nobody to back you up there on helping with that. So it's not a hard sales pitch. It's just a fact of the reality of having lived with having to support all of those learning standards. You know, there is a time frame that you could do it if you have people who know all the standards and the desire to do it, but there are considerations beyond that that probably are more important than that. At least that's my personal opinion about it.
I love Troy's comment here, so I'm just going to read it off. Thanks, Troy. We built our own SCORM engine years ago. It was too much trouble to maintain it and keep up with every standard. So we went to Rustici and have lived happily ever after.
Yeah.
What a great story on the heels
There,
of Valentine's Day,
yeah.
Troy. We really appreciate that.
Yeah.
But no, it's a common story, to be honest. So we partner with hundreds of LMSs across the industry where Engine is running behind the scenes, and nearly every one of them went through some version of should we build this or just buy. And I often say that our team often says, supporting these e-learning standards may not necessarily set you apart from your competition. It's doing it well could, and so why not let us sort of take the burden there, and you guys can go focus your time on other features that could set you apart. So it's often what it comes down to. And again, as Kyle and Ben mentioned, there's been several folks that have gone down the path of building, and they end up coming and talking to us anyway at some point. So yeah, did I cut anybody off, Ben or Kyle? Were you going to add anything else there?
No.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, so I think we've got a couple minutes left here. I don't see any other questions that had come in live. So I'll just mention here real quick. So if we didn't get to your question, we tried to sort of organize these and maybe combine some that were related. If you feel like we didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out to support@rusticisoftware.com at any time. If you have general questions about even just the e-learning world, we're happy to answer and give whatever insight we can there. But yeah, we really appreciate everybody's time and joining the webinar today, submitting questions ahead of time, and obviously those that are current customers. We really appreciate the business and look forward to working with those that may be engine curious at the moment. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you have more questions. You will be receiving the recording with an email that has all the links that we've probably posted here in the chat, lots of resources to things that we've talked about, but there's a ton of information there. So again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have more, and thanks again for joining, everybody.
One last thing, there will be a survey that goes out about today's webinars. So it'd be great if you want to take a little bit, just a few moments and fill that out, help us to, improve or think about the next one that we do.
Great catch, Kyle. I failed here as an MC at the end. What a team. Great teamwork. Yeah. Thanks, Kyle. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it.